Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rachel Paul with IAAP and we're happy to have you for our webinar today. Before we get started, just a few items to go over. We do have closed captioning provided. You can select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We do have all attendee mics muted to prevent any background noise or disruptions. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on the IAAP YouTube channel, and we'll show you how you can connect to that later. We will be taking questions today. I encourage you to leave your questions throughout in the Q&A, and we will also be monitoring the chat for any general dialogue or technical issues. I'm happy to turn today's program over to Christopher Lee to introduce our panelists and start our program.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you. We have over 214 people registered for this webinar. It's an exciting topic that we haven't covered at IAAP before, so we really appreciate the opportunity to have an incredible moderator and panelists that we have today, and you'll learn a lot more about these folks in just a few minutes. I'm the Managing Director of IAAP, and today's topic is how do you lip read a robot? Is AI-powered unfairness avoidable? Interesting topic. I love the title. Susan, thank you very much for that. And we're going to dive into all kinds of aspects of AI today. Our panelists are going to talk about, the impacts and concerns about employment seekers with disabilities using AI systems for recruitment. That's one area that we're going to really touch. We're also going to dive into a little bit of, what are employees doing with the knowledge and evaluation of tools to ensure innovation and recruitment is fair for all users. We're going to hit what can data scientists and AI developers do to minimize risk to employers and job seekers. We're also going to get into what can we expect from regulators, which is going to be really interesting, and the psychology, kind of does AI, the personality assessments accurately predict everyone's job performance. So there's a lot to cover today, and we're pretty excited about. One of the action items that Susan and I talked about prior to this webinar was, what can we do at G3ICT and IAAP to push this important issue? And the first step is to let people know about it, to let our members know about it, and hence why we're having the webinar. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan, a colleague and a friend, with a very impressive background. So Susan is a thought leader on how to mobilize business leadership behind the economic and social inclusion with disabilities to mobilize businesses. She's an advisor to the ILO, Global Business Disability Network, and Valuable 500. She's a global ambassador for the Essie Foundation, which is tied to the Zero Project. And, a little bit of icing on the cake, she's an awardee of the Order of the British Empire. Not so bad, Susan. It is wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining us today, and thank the panelists.
Well, thank you. I should have spotted that thing about this defunct British Empire. However, we'll come back to that at another time. Well, welcome everyone. It's really so important for us to be able, with G3ICT and IAAP, to reach out to an audience that we know has a very strong understanding of the importance of accessibility in a very broad sense, as well as in terms of accessible technology. We need your help, and that's why we're here. So if I could just very briefly introduce our distinguished panel. We have Julia Stoyanovich. Julia is the Assistant Professor of Computer Science and Engineering and Founding Director of the Center for Responsible AI at New York University. We've got Inmaculada Placencia Porrero. She is in fact the Senior Expert for Disability and Inclusion for the entire European Commission. We've somehow got an outdated job title next to her, but she's more important than that. So hear me say what I say. And then we have Nigel Guelome. Nigel is Director of Research at Goldsmiths, University of London. I'm positive it was Nigel who gave me this phrase, science or snake oil. So I'm really looking forward to what he has to say about whether or not some of the assessments that we're talking about today can predict anyone's performance, never mind if that individual sitting in front of the camera has a disability. And so in terms of the plan, I'm going to set the stage, the scene, if you like, talking a little bit about why I started down this road and what we've discovered as we look at the impact of this technology. And then we'll have an input from Julia, and then Emma, and then Nigel. And then it's open for a free-for-all for questions, refereed, I'm sure, by Chris. So if I could just say a few words. I call it How Do You Lip Read a Robot? Because there is a particular robot in my mind working in Sweden, and I'll come to her a bit later, and I don't think you can lip read her. And so it triggered a line of inquiry for me. Actually, the real work started, however, when I read an article which quoted a well-known recruitment technology company saying how they were so proud that their standardized assessment process removed human bias because every candidate would be treated exactly the same. I was startled. I mean, surely everybody knows that the essence of treating disabled candidates fairly is to flex the process, to make the reasonable adjustments or accommodations at every stage, which create what we used to call that level playing field. I mean, it's called equal opportunities. So, just imagine asking the late, great Stephen Hawkins to climb stairs to the interview just because the standard process says everybody has to use the stairs. So I started to ask questions. It immediately became clear that for many recruiters, their primary task, given the huge numbers now applying online, is to discard as many candidates as possible, as quickly as possible. It also, however, became immediately clear that neither developers nor their HR customers, despite all the talk about bias, were asking about disability bias. No one was talking about the impact of these tools on people with disabilities. The need for fair, ethical, responsible treatment of the world's more than 1.3 billion persons with disabilities is simply not on the HR, tech, and AI agenda. And then as we looked more closely at this, you could almost call it exploding HR tech marketplace, there are at least 1,500 products at the moment out in there. We realized that we were looking at AI-powered HR tools which have the potential to damage the life chances of hundreds of millions of persons with disabilities around the world. This, even though at least 1 in 3 humans will be disabled or close to someone who is. 15 to 20% of the population of any country will have a disability. 1 in 5 women will have a disability. Even though at least 1 in 3 people aged 50 to 64 will have a disability regardless of ethnicity. Even though at least 10 to 12% of any large workforce will have a disability and/or chronic health condition. And even though, if we live to be 70, which most of us would like to do, we will experience at least 10 years of disability ourselves. So this is why I was so puzzled at not seeing people with disabilities ever referenced in this growing debate. In fact, it seems that disabled people are so missing that no one's even noticed they're not there. To illustrate, I was told that a tool designed explicitly to detect AI bias can't detect disability bias because, quote, they aren't in the database. Well, given disabled people are always at least twice as unlikely to be in work, and given most of the HR tech data focuses on people in work, well, I guess it's safe to say, if you aren't in that database now, you never will be. So if we just look for a minute at the actual assessment tools, and remembering that neither their content, their usability, nor their accessibility has been validated or tested on job seekers or employees with disabilities. So we've got the video interviews, which assess the extent to which your nonverbals, your word choice, voice pattern, eye movement, facial expression, etc., match or align with those of their ideal employee. But these ignore the impact of disability on the candidate's nonverbals, word choice, voice tone, eye movement, etc. And then we have my favorite, this virtual reality test that drops you into an ancient Egyptian tomb to test your problem-solving skills. Well, my friend, who's used a wheelchair since he was a very little boy, says he dreams in his wheelchair. He said, would that virtual reality test let him use his wheelchair inside the ancient tomb? Well, we've looked into it, and the answer is no. He would have to cope with the surprise of walking in that virtual reality environment. And we've got the increasingly popular gamified assessments. How many have actually checked that the gaming controls can be used by people with limited dexterity or even color blindness? Did you see that post on LinkedIn? A young man whose Tourette's syndrome causes his hands to twitch. He wrote saying it was impossible to find any human recruiters to talk to, so he could explain that he could do the job, he just could not play the game. And then we have this crucial but unrecognized difference between biased data and discriminatory or unfair treatment, which is triggered by how the process actually works in practice. Just things like no captions on the video interview, timing candidates out after 3 minutes. But let's just take the Swedish robot interviewer. The website claims they have eliminated human bias regarding race and gender. There's no reference to disability bias, but then there never is. The question would be, how does this robot deal with the candidate who could sail through if he could lip read that robot or use a sign language interpreter? I mean, has this robot been briefed that you don't interview the interpreter? How does the robot adapt for the excellent candidate who stammers and needs a little more than the standard 20 minutes? Or someone who could do the job, but because of their intellectual disability, needs that robot to turn the standard questions into shorter sentences. How does someone with, should we call it a non-standard face, facial disfigurement, acid burn, Down syndrome, get through the video interview when their face doesn't even register as a face? Or someone who doesn't make eye contact because they can't, or doesn't smile because they can't? Standardized, let's call them what they are, rigid recruitment processes are by definition inherently discriminatory, and the interaction with the technology creates a double or triple whammy. So who is responsible for ensuring equal opportunities at every step? So the developers say it's the employer's responsibility in law. Well, depends on jurisdictions. The employer says, but our supplier tells us this inflexible process is unbiased because it is standardized, if they think of disability at all. Neither make it possible at any stage for the applicant to request dignified and equitable access to equal opportunities that are only made possible by adjusting the process so they can apply on an equal footing. And then we've got the fourth dimension to this problem. So one, we've got the disability bias in the data. Two, we've got standardized processes that trigger discrimination. Three, we've got HR buyers, diversity managers, and AI developers who do not understand disability discrimination. And then in addition, we have developers who ignore the impact of the future employer's behavior on the tool's ability to accurately assess a given candidate. How could an AI tool accurately assess a blind cybersecurity expert if it fails to ask, will the employer let this candidate use the tools she needs when she starts the jobs? Voice-activated software, whatever. She cannot be accurately assessed for this cybersecurity job unless the AI tool recognizes that blindness on its own need not preclude high performance, unless the tool does not assume successful candidates will make eye contact in the usual way, unless the assessment takes into account that the employer will or will not make the reasonable adjustments that she requires in order to succeed, and unless the process does not stigmatize the candidate who is regarded by the AI tool as so non-standard that an expensive human assessor has to be brought into play. So that's kind of the background to this conversation. The good news is we are making progress. Well, we're here today, for example. We've had the first white paper, Recruitment AI has a Disability Problem, produced by the Oxford Brook University's Institute for Ethical AI, who would welcome comment. IBM recently publishing a second paper, Designing AI Applications to Treat People with Disabilities Fairly, 6 Steps to Fairness. And again, I know IBM, who work closely with us, would welcome any comment. Simmons & Simmons, the global employment law firm, continue to work with us to look at the guidance that HR and procurement require if they are to minimize the risks. This is the buyer beware territory for us. And we have this much appreciated opportunity to engage with you as potential allies, helping us to position disability as an ethical imperative in this broader debate. And we see human rights and equality regulators beginning to consider adopting some of the principles that shape consumer protection. I would certainly argue that developers should be required by law to prove their AI recruitment tools are safe for disabled and other disadvantaged job seekers before they can put them on the market. And in conclusion, and I don't need to tell this audience, we know that systems that work for extreme users work better for everyone. If these AI assessment tools enabled someone who is deaf, blind, dyslexic, autistic, facially disfigured, mobility impaired, and if they enable those individuals to be recruited on the basis of capability and potential, well, that would make it easier for everyone to compete on merit. And my throwaway is usually so that even a not yet disabled Canadian woman can get through. So I wanted to present the context for this conversation because we need to be focused as much as we can on the real practicalities here, the concrete impact that the increased use of this technology by HR people around the world is starting to deliver. So I now have the pleasure of introducing Julia Stoyanovich. And Julia, you're going to help the developers on this call figure out what they need to do differently if we're going to ensure that they play their part. Now I'm looking at Sam Evans's name on my screen. Rachel, is Julia coming up, or
Yes,
can you
thank you.
help us out here? Oh, there she is. Excellent. Julia, thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the kind introduction, and it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be here. Could someone just please confirm verbally if you're seeing my slides and not the notes? Just so
I
we
can
are.
see the slides.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as Susan said, I'm Julia Stoyanovich. I'm an assistant professor of computer science and engineering and of data science at New York University. And I also direct the newly established Center for Responsible AI at NYU. And today I was asked specifically about what I believe that technologists need to know or what they should do to be responsive to the needs of individuals with disabilities in the context of algorithmic hiring. As we already heard from Susan's wonderful introduction, commercial tools are being used by employers, large and small, to hire more efficiently, source and screen candidates faster and with less paperwork, and select candidates who likely will do well on the job. These tools are also meant to improve efficiency for the job seekers, allowing them to apply for a job with a click of a button, matching them with relevant positions and facilitating the interview process. And we also often hear the argument that the use of these tools can help us improve workforce diversity. And the argument goes that because humans are biased, we have no choice but to use machines to step in and hire on our behalf. And yet, despite their potential to improve efficiency for both employers and job applicants, automated hiring tools are also raising concerns. There have been multiple reports of these tools discriminating against applicants based on gender and race and disability status. Very often, discrimination is linked to the term bias, a term that we will revisit momentarily. There are also concerns about whether these tools actually work, whether they are picking up useful signal from the data or are an elaborate coin flip at best. As Arvind Narayanan, computer science professor at Princeton, puts it, are these tools AI snake oil? We will hear more about this later in the panel today. To address concerns about discrimination and validity, whether the tools in fact work, there are ongoing efforts to regulate the use of automated hiring tools. And this is also a topic that will be discussed later on the panel today, but I would like to mention this briefly, bringing to your attention the proposal for a law that would regulate the use of, as they're called here, automated employment decision tools in New York City. If passed, the law will apply to the use of these tools both in government and in industry, and it will prohibit the sale of such tools if they were not the subject of an audit for bias. The law will also require to disclose to candidates when such tools were used to assess their candidacy for employment, and also to disclose what job qualifications or characteristics were used in the screening. Technologists will be tasked with developing auditing methods and methods for disclosure. And this is why this, of course, is relevant to our discussion today. So let's talk about the first component of the proposed bill, an audit for bias. Very often, bias in AI is linked to bias in the training data. I like to think about data as a mirror reflection of the world. With this in mind, it becomes clear that any and all effects of discriminatory behavior in the real world will, of course, be reflected in the data. And also that it may be worthwhile to wear corrective lenses, as is depicted on this slide, to debias the data or the AI or to correct the decisions. But this essentially amounts to brushing up the reflection at a particular decision point. And while brushing up the reflection may be worthwhile, we should not be fooling ourselves. To make lasting change, we have to work much harder to make these changes stick in the real world. Debiasing on its own may be worthwhile, but it will never be enough. Alexandra Reeve-Gibbons, Hilke Shellman, and I recently published our reaction to the proposed New York City bill in a New York Times op-ed. In this article, we speak to the need to test the tools for validity, in addition to testing them for bias. We say that the bill should also require validity testing to ensure that the tools actually measure what they claim to measure, and it must make certain that they measure characteristics that are relevant for the job. Such testing would interrogate whether, for example, candidates' effort to blow up a balloon in an online game really indicate their appetite for risk in the real world, and also whether risk-taking is necessary for the job. We hope that mandatory validity testing would also eliminate bad actors whose hiring tools do arbitrary things, like assess job applicants' personalities differently based on subtle changes in the background of their video interviews. And we got some really fun comments on this article. One of my favorite ones was that someone writing that if they knew that a company was asking them to blow up balloons to decide whether to hire them, they would think that that company was stupid and they wouldn't want to work there. So we technologists know, and we should not forget, for all the hype and the magical thinking and the substantial opportunities for financial gain, that AI tools are engineering artifacts. We should not take or make the claim that they work on faith. To know whether these tools work, we should use the scientific method. Formulate a hypothesis that states, in a falsifiable way, that the tool indeed selects employees who will do well on the job, and is better at predicting that than a random guess would be. We would formulate this hypothesis in a way that is falsifiable. So what is falsifiability? The philosopher of science Karl Popper explains it eloquently, stating, a theory or idea shouldn't be scientific unless it could in principle be proven false. Getting back to our article, we speak to the need to tell candidates how they will be screened by an automated tool before the screening, so candidates know what to expect. People who are blind, for example, may not suspect that their video interview could score poorly if they fail to make eye contact with the camera. If they know what is being tested, they can engage with the employer to seek a fairer test. I'm illustrating this here by quoting Haben Girma, a disability rights advocate. She says, "My eyes move involuntarily, each one singing to its own music. They've danced this way for as long as I can remember." In her writing, she speaks to intersectional discrimination experienced by individuals who are multiply marginalized, for example, those who are both blind and Black. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that hiring systems are designed, developed, and used in ways that benefit all of us, rather than reinforcing disparities and benefiting the select few? or acting in ways that are arbitrary and uncontestable? We all are responsible. Who decides what data these systems rely on, how they use that data, and against what objectives we assess them? Who decides how we prioritize the cost of one mistake or of 1,000 mistakes of one kind against 1,000 mistakes of another kind? We all have to decide. And in particular, we technologists carry much of this responsibility. But to make progress, we need to step outside our engineering comfort zone and start reasoning in terms of values and beliefs, in addition to checking results against known ground truths and optimizing for efficiency objectives. This seems high risk, but one of the upsides is being able to explain to our children what we do and why it matters. On a related note, an important choice that we technologists can make is what problems we work on. For example, accessibility advocate Chancey Fleet speaks about ghost-written code. Akin to how a ghostwriter is the person who is paid to compose a novel that someone else could not be bothered to write themselves, ghost-written code is software that the organization has offloaded on programmers to design for users that they cannot be bothered to engage with or employ themselves. Rather than ghostwriting code that enables accessibility, what about making that part of tooling a priority? What about developing AI methods that are specifically working for individuals with disabilities? Rather than developing platforms that encode in hospitality, another term due to Chancey Fleet, we should be thinking about how to use AI to improve accessibility. If you'd like to learn more about my point of view on this, please take a look at our comic series on responsible AI that I'm creating together with the very talented Fala Arif Khan. Disability concerns are prominent in both volumes of the comic that we released so far. Thank you very much. Susan, you're muted.
She's still muted. Susan, you're still muted. This is Christopher. Julia, that was fascinating. I cannot wait to read the comic.
Thank you.
Is that an Amazon thing? Was that?
It's in the open source. It's on GitHub and it's accessible with a screen reader. The first volume of the comic has been translated into Spanish and French. And we plan to also translate the second volume. We already started with the French translation.
Excellent.
Brilliant. Great. Well, and I found my cursor again, so we're back. So thank you for that. I want to quickly now move on because we want to hear from Immaculada. If you can give us an insight into the world of the regulators, and they're very interesting to see what they're doing in New York. Can you picture anything like that happening in Europe?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me start saying that there are different elements that we would need to address from the regulatory perspective or the regulatory context in which we are today in Europe. And they cover also different elements or components of artificial intelligence that have been mentioned today already. I mean, it's clear that the European regulatory framework in relation to employment is protecting persons with disabilities from discrimination. In addition, I mean, part of the directive that concerns protection from discrimination in employment, it puts an obligation of reasonable accommodation and subject to disproportionate burden. Let me say that in this directive would cover all conditions for access to employment, including self-employment or occupation, selection criteria, recruitment conditions, and at all levels of professions and hierarchy, including promotions. It addresses, by the way, also vocational guidance and training, and the employment working conditions, and even the membership on organizations of workers. So let's say that this framework for non-discrimination is very wide, and in principle it can be used when discrimination is due to issues related to artificial intelligence, whether it is tools used in the process of recruitment or even in the workplace. Let me also say that even in the recital related to reasonable accommodation, which is a requirement under the directive, as I said, and it refers to the need to take appropriate measures where needed for a particular person in a particular case, to advance in employment or undergo training. It refers to adaptations of the workplace to the disability, and it puts as an example adapting premises and equipment, patterns or working time, but equipment is specifically mentioned. So I think that this general protection of discrimination is the first step or would be a first step to address, let's say, a protected environment for persons with disabilities. Of course, this is one aspect only of many of the issues that have been mentioned today already. I mean, when we look to the main components of artificial intelligence, we are talking here about not only the algorithms that could be used, or the tools, but we have the issue of the data and the user interface used needing to be accessible and recognizing this diversity that should include, of course, persons with disabilities. So we go also into then addressing issues, for example, related to accessibility, which are not part of the protection from discrimination. These are addressed in another regulatory set of rules at European level. To start with, let me say that we have got very recent legislation on accessibility that addresses computers, operating systems, websites, and the web content and tools, and even mobile device-based tools. And those need to be made accessible for persons with disabilities. So I think that as long as these type of devices or online services or mobile services are going to be used for the purpose of recruitment or not, they should be they would have they would be covered to a certain extent by our accessibility legislation. And let me highlight that we have accessibility rules for public sector websites that would need also to be applied. In addition, if we're talking about these new tools for based on artificial intelligence or not, I mean, the public procurement directives require that they should be accessible. Now, when it comes to the questions put here or the issues raised about safety or other elements of artificial intelligence, we do not have yet at European level a comprehensive legislation addressing specifically these issues. There is a general product safety legislation, and there are sectorial legislative acts, but the specifically addressing these issues is not yet put in place. However, let me tell you that the Commission is being concerned on these issues, and since a number of years ago, the Commission has an agenda for making addressing the digital age in Europe, and there has been a white paper being proposed on artificial intelligence that address some of these issues that we are discussing today. Already in 2018, the Commission put forward a European approach to artificial intelligence and created a high-level expert group that provided two important deliverables. One, ethics guidelines for trustworthy artificial intelligence, and that contains policy recommendations in that way. And there was a coordinated plan on artificial intelligence also proposed. And currently, and then in 2019, there was a communication called Building Trust in Human-Centric Artificial Intelligence, and where there were several requirements for artificial intelligence being trustworthy. I have to say that in this white paper I mentioned for 2020, it sets out policy options for investment, and there is a reflection. There was a reflection ongoing, and the Commission has announced some measures in the near future, but I cannot. Sorry, I cannot disclose them at this moment. But just to tell you that this issue is hot in the Commission agenda, and we are reflecting on that. And soon there will be some more concrete reactions to the use of artificial intelligence. I would like also to say that we adopted, the Commission adopted in the 3rd of March, a new strategy. A strategy for the rights of persons with disabilities, where the issue of going digital is really very prominent from an accessibility point of view, but also it refers that the Commission will pay close attention to the correct implementation of current existing legislation and will identify gaps and the needs for further legislative action. And to that end, we announced the creation of a resource center on it will be called Accessible EU. It will be launched in 2022 to increase coherence on these policies and facilitate access to relevant knowledge. I think there is a strong, there is a deficit on knowledge on accessibility and disability related issues when we talk about technology in general. And the idea is to bring together in a framework authorities responsible for implementing and enforcing rules with professionals from all areas of accessibility, and not only share the practice and inspire, but also inspire policy developments in all this area, including on the digital area. And it is important to know that we are supporting the implementation of the public procurement directives and promoting training for public procurers to buy specifically accessible. Let me also highlight an element that has not, that I think it has a great potential, and that it's referred to in the strategy, and that is the use of artificial intelligence, and in areas, I mean, could be robotics, could be other areas, to design on-site and remote services tailored to the needs of persons with disabilities. I mean, I think we need to maximize the potential that artificial technology has to address the flexibility, I would say, that is needed in these new ICT tools, so that persons with disabilities have choice, can use this potential for having their choice and preferences, and adaptability of the tools for their own interest and benefits. So to sum up, I would say that we have a framework for accessibility, we have a framework for non-discrimination. It has not been tested yet, to put it that way, for the specificities of artificial intelligence, but the framework is pretty wide. And we are working on the issues of artificial intelligence and developments are coming soon. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Emma. I think, as I listen, what we're trying to convey to both buyers and to the developers is that the regulations will be coming as individuals like yourselves, carrying the information, the research back into your institutions, and that it's only wise to actually lift into best practice in this territory so that you're well above what any regulations are going to look like when they do come through. So I see we have a couple of questions. Can we proceed, do you think, Chris, with listening to Nigel at this point and then have some questions after his presentation?
This is Christopher. Yes, Susan, let's go ahead and move to the next presenter, Nigel.
Super. Nigel, maybe it wasn't you who introduced me to the concept of snake oil as I listened to Julia. Maybe I just jumped to that conclusion.
Yeah. Okay, so can you see my slides, Susan?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so guys, I saw one question, is anybody researching this in Europe? I'm researching this in Europe. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist and a quantitative psychologist, and I'm gonna, I think, have similar messages to the panel so far, but coming at it from a psychological angle. So I'll say that the hiring assessment landscape is changing dramatically. We're seeing new technologies, new data sources, and new algorithms, and used appropriately, these can produce, useful results. One question is useful for who, but they can produce useful results for organizations. However, there's inadequate attention being paid to particular groups, particularly disabilities, which just haven't been on the roadmap, and I've been talking to Susan for a few years now, and she's changed my views a lot. So I'll talk about some observations I have on why the situation is the way it is and some thoughts on some ways forward. So this slide just shows what I call the two testing revolutions that I've seen go on in my living memory and all of our living memory. So the people might remember this on the left here, where you used to take the tests and you would color in the correct answer, and it was all paper-based, and it was a bit annoying because if you missed one out, then everything else was wrong subsequently. Then in the kind of, they started doing this online, and the internet really, in the late 90s, well, mid-90s, really boosted adoption of that. People were really concerned that it would lead to unfairness and it would lead to a lack of validity, but it turned out that it didn't lead to any less validity than we already experienced, or much less bias than or more or less bias than we already experienced. And that's because the tasks that people do in the computerized version is essentially exactly the same. You click a button, you color in a piece of a circle on the paper, and you select a radio button on the on the computer. The new testing revolution that we're seeing is this jump from just computerized testing through to these new AI systems and these gamified systems. And what we're seeing is there are new types of data being used, often that weren't generated by the user with the intent of being selected or being hired and going for a job. They're often collected in games where people don't really know what they're actually being assessed for. And there is also the challenge that the accessibility challenge where people with disabilities can't even get access. So there is more, I'd say that there is good reason for there to be more concern now with this second testing revolution in living memory than there was with the first one. So what's driving all of this along? Well, here are some things that people have said to me recently. These are kind of senior hiring and talent acquisition professionals. So one, the first one there, questionnaires are 20th century technology, and we need to deliver 21st century experiences. So there is this view that these new methods are much more fun. They give the same experience that we have personally with our mobile devices that we can't leave alone. We bring that from the kind of consumer world into the work world. And organizations want that because they want you to go for a job, but they want to be able to tell you maybe you didn't get that job, but they want you to say, gee, that was fun, and still buy products from them. And they want you to tell all your friends it's a great place to work and to apply for the job again next time. There is also a lot of new algorithmic methods. So this is something that a very prominent psychometrician said to me. He's published in Journal of the American Statistical Association. He said, my colleagues around here think classical psychometric methods are too careful and too slow. And now what they're using a lot more is these machine learning methods, you know, predictive ensemble kind of models that average across all different sorts of models. The challenge is a lot of what we know about how to check for bias is actually developed for some of these classical methods. So the workhorses that we know a lot about aren't the ones that people are starting to use in these AI systems. And then finally, we have another chief talent officer there saying we now consider the candidate experience just as important as prediction of post-hire performance. And that's a real about face from a decade ago when people would primarily have been interested in validity, you know, does this kind of work? But now they're interested in, is it fun? And when they say, is it fun? It's really, is it fun for the majority? It's not, is it fun for the people who can't have access here? So what's happening as a result of these changes? Well, we're seeing solutions from very well marketed venture capital backed startups. There are some major firms doing it too. The assessments are said to leverage neuroscience, artificial intelligence, machine learning, serious games, gamification, social media, fit algorithms, you know, you name it, there is somebody doing it. And the question is, do they work? And the answer is sometimes. And we heard a little discussion about validity earlier in the talk, and I want to just show, this is a process, this slide shows a validity process that's playing out irrespective of whether people build this graph. But what we have is a score on a test on the vertical axis and somebody's subsequent performance on the horizontal axis. And we have a circle in the top right, which is a great decision. So the test said the person would be good and the person turned out to be good. But we also have some bad decisions where we have the square, and in the square, we thought the person would be really good, so they're really high up, but unfortunately they turned out to be poor performers. And in the triangle, we have a person who was predicted to be bad, but turned out to be very good. And what the organizations and industrial psychology has done is said, we're comfortable if we're right more than we're wrong. So if we can get a relationship like that going, we're generally pretty happy, with a few exceptions. And the exception is this big yellow circle down here. And this big circle down here, this big yellow one, we check currently to see whether its membership is disproportionately Black, is it disproportionately female, is it disproportionately disabled. However, the big missing piece of the puzzle, as Susan has educated me, is, are people with disabilities even able to get on the graph? Are they even able to be represented on the graph? Do they have the opportunity to take the assessment in the same way? And unfortunately, often the case, as things currently stand, is no, they don't. So I have a couple of one more slide with some observations. There are, when I'm working with technologists, I see two interpretations of the phrase "it's working." On one level, there is a technological interpretation where a number is generated, a number is pushed around. But I think that the more important one is a sociological interpretation, which is broader. It encompasses whether the number gets generated, but it also takes account of whether that number corresponds to anything in reality and whether there are any unexpected social consequences. So it's really important to have that broader interpretation. Also, bias analyses, like I just showed on the previous slide, which we've been comfortable with, relatively comfortable with, they don't address accessibility. Accessibility is something that we need to really start to focus on, and treating everybody the same just maintains the existing inequalities, unfortunately. I think that left to their own devices, vendors are unlikely to fix the situation on their own, and very likely an outside prompt is needed. I think that audits are a very important thing, but I think that you know, once somebody's paid to perform an audit, they're in a difficult position where they're a customer, or they're a client, you know, so there is this client-customer relationship. So I think it's very hard to get the objectivity. I think it's very important to have users, those affected by the system, so people with disabilities, working with social scientists and technologists in the design of these systems, rather than just designing and then trying to retrofit. Also have parallel application tracks. So if you know, the video kind of interviewing doesn't work for you, you need to be able to quickly switch tracks into something that's more appropriate and lets you show your strengths. And the last point I think I'll make is that, I don't know if this is a controversial one, but it's one that kind of goes around in my mind, is that I think we can all make contributions to addressing this, and we all need to. And I also feel that the bigger your firm, the more responsibility you really need to shoulder in trying to fix this situation. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Well, and thank you, Nigel. How interesting. I'm intrigued, of course, by your validity chart, but I'm wondering if we have questions from the audience. Christopher,
We do. This is Christopher. Yeah, we do have some questions, and I don't know if the panelists can see them in the Q&A, but the first one, I believe Emma might go to you, and that deals with the EU GDPR. Do you have any thoughts around that particular question?
What is the question, in fact?
It's quite a long question by Mike.
Does it have the right? I guess the question is, does the data subject have the right not to be subject to this decision?
Well, this is a very complex question. I mean, it's a question about the application of the data protection, the General Data Protection Regulation, and I would not dare to just say provide a categorical answer. But I would turn it around and saying that there should be nothing in principle, because we are related to artificial intelligence, that would exclude by definition the issues. Now, I assume that they say, is this addressed? This is very wide. I mean, what is this? I would turn it around and say that data protection does not stop at the data protection regulation does not stop when they see the word artificial intelligence. In relation to the second question that I mentioned myself, it's about this trustworthy reference, and the question is whether that is an interesting concept, and whether you propose how do we propose to measure it. And in fact, well, I don't propose to measure it, but we have in the group that I mentioned in the report that I mentioned, issued by the independent high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, on ethics and trustworthy artificial intelligence, that was published in 2019. They set seven principles for trustworthy artificial intelligence. I mean, I can quickly go through them, but the first one relates to the development, deployment of systems that have human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy, data and governance, transparency, diversity and non-discrimination and fairness, environmental and societal well-being, and accountability. And I mean, I recommend you to read the document. That, by the way, it requires, when in relation to the ethical principles, to pay particular attention when the situations involving persons with disabilities. And it's really based on the principles of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. So this is for the the second question. And I don't know if I should continue on the fourth one, which it was about accessibility. just very briefly to say that, of course, software tools, there is no regulation in Europe for software tools or software programs to be accessible as such. I mean, to place in the market only software programs which are accessible. However, we have three instruments that can help here. The first one I already mentioned. I mean, if you are in a workplace and you need to use tools for artificial intelligence in your work, reasonable accommodation should be provided for including, as I said, the equipment use. The second is if this is a public sector, procurement will enter into the scope, meaning tools. Software tools also bought by under the public procurement directives should be accessible. And the third one is that when EU funds are involved in adaptations of workplaces or creation of jobs, then also accessibility is a requirement. And then I give you the floor back to you, because I think all the questions were kind of addressed to me. So
Thank you, Emma. Anybody else, Nigel, Julia, on those questions? Trustworthy?
Yeah, so I've actually responded in writing, giving a reference there, and I responded to a few of the other questions. So trust is very difficult to measure, as is accountability, as is interpretability. But I think that despite the fact that these are difficult to measure, we must find ways to do so. Because otherwise we're just taking it on faith that these systems work by any definition, technical or social or socio-technical, right? And so one of the examples that I spoke about in my written response is a paper that is a kind of a position paper that I worked on together with social psychology colleagues about the relationship between interpretability of algorithmic processes and trust. And I think that the promising metaphor there is a visual one, and that is one of a nutritional label, where depending on to whom you are trying to convey information, to explain how a process works, and for what purpose, you would be customizing the way that this nutritional label looks, again, based on their needs, and ultimately to enable them to act, to contest a decision, to do something, to request an alternative testing environment, for example, or to try and go and get a certification that would be required for them to be more successful in their application, or to go and change the laws, right? To actually lobby for there to be a social or a legal change.
Thank you, Julia. Nigel, you have anything to add on this particular issue?
Just that I see Julia's working with social psychologists, and the psychologists spend a lot of time trying to measure trust. There are various definitions, like the willingness to be vulnerable to these or exposed to these artificial intelligence systems. And the irony of it is some of the techniques that that we would use to measure trust are some of the techniques that we're criticizing here in terms of the measurement of job-related attributes, but there is kind of work going on in that area.
And I think for me, just to say, when I come back to what you were talking about earlier, Nigel, we've also got the interaction with the buyer, with the HR people, with the recruiters, and that one of the biggest issues is, one, giving the tool the agency to discard candidates without any human oversight, and two, only having one route in. One rigid route in. So regardless of where the tool is in that route. So I think we have to tackle it from both the buyer and the developer side, and let the regulators come in with some creativity in time.
I know at the end, but the one question I did have throughout was, do we know if any employers are doing work around this right now, in the sense of some of the larger tech companies? Are there any kind of like profiles out there of companies?
Well, IBM has been very helpful, and with their 6 steps to fairness, they're now looking at how they operationalize those internally, so that they, in effect, in the jargon, walk the talk of what they said they recommended others do. But no, we're not aware of any HR departments that are really looking at this carefully, if we wanted to be particular.
Gotcha.
If there's anybody in the audience who can help us to capture their attention, that would be very welcome.
Yeah, please let us know. We are at the very end. I want to thank Susan. This was excellent. I'm so glad that we connected on this issue, and we will continue to push this issue with IAAP. Julia, Nigel, Emma, thank you so much for your time and expertise today. I want to thank the captioners and obviously the IAAP team for putting this on, and all our guests. I did want to just let everyone know that we did pull the numbers, and we did have 20 countries in industries, including education, government, high tech, consulting, engineering, and again, consulting. So we had quite a wide range of individuals participating. So thank you again, and have a good rest of the day, afternoon, and evening. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.